The message today is life in the millennium. It's a topic I don't think many people put much thought into. The Bible gives us a fair bit of information to understand the general outlines of what life will be like, but we don't really think it through and understand how life will be different at that time. And that's what the point of this video is going to be. So, life in the millennium. We know that Jesus, when he returns, will be the king of the world and he will rule over everything. And we know that that's going to be a 1,000-year period, and that lasts 1,000 years. And then after that comes Judgment Day. And so we know those things are different. What are the consequences of those things? And so we don't really think much about what life is going to be during that 1,000 years. Maybe remember a verse from Isaiah that says there will be no war. That sounds kind of nice. Yeah, sure, that's great. That sounds good. I don't want any more wars. Um, but we don't really think those things through, and that's what we're going to do here. And we're going to discover is that life at that time will be shockingly different than it is now. It will not be recognizable. And I'm not even going to deal with all of the different things that are going to be in here, just to give you kind of a sampling of the things that you can really show well from Scripture. But there are going to be a lot of other very noticeable differences that are going to be there as well. So we're not in Kansas anymore. It's not going to be like the world that we live in now. It'll be quite different. For first of all, and maybe most importantly, there will be 4 different classes of beings on the earth, and that's something we haven't seen in our experience. And we live our lives in a society that likes to think of everything being equal. Each person is equal, and that's even treated as being identical. Of course, people aren't identical, but we kind of think of everybody as being more or less equal. That will not be the case at that time. There are going to be 4 different classes of beings. At the top of them is going to be Jesus and God, who will be living on the earth at that time, living on the earth. And there will be the transformed people. And by transformed people, I mean those people who are resurrected into new bodies and those people who are transformed into new bodies, those who were believers. And then next in line would be the angels, and then after that, ordinary people. So there's going to be a very different society. It's going to have people in it, ordinary people in it, but in addition to that, people who are extraordinary people and angels and much different things. And there's a purpose to all of it being this way. And so it's going to be a different society right from the outset. Another thing we've almost certainly heard, because there are so many mentions of it, especially in Revelation, is that Jesus will rule with a rod of iron. And I have a whole bunch of verses here I'm going to go through. And sharp swords came out of their mouths, by which they will kill the nations, and he will shepherd them with a rod of iron, and he treads the winepress of the wrath of Almighty God. Revelation 12:5. And she delivered the son, the male, who was to shepherd all the nations with a rod of iron. Revelation 2:26-27. To him who is victorious and keeps my works, I shall give authority over the nations, to shepherd them with a rod of iron, and like the vessels of a potter you shall shatter them, for in the same manner I have also received my Father. And those were all references from Revelation, and so ruling with a rod of iron is something that Revelation really focuses on, because it's really all about the coming of Jesus, the return of Jesus to rule the earth. And so you would expect to have a lot of references there. But there are also Old Testament references, and here's a couple of those. From Psalms 2:9 it says, and you shall break them with a rod of iron, you shall shatter them like earthenware, which goes right back to the previous verse. In fact, the previous verse was probably a quote of that. And then up from Isaiah 11:4 it says, but with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. So what all of these verses come down to is that sin will not be allowed to happen in that period, in that millennial period, that 1,000-year period. And we'll talk a little bit later about how exactly that will be managed so that sin doesn't happen, because that's something you simply couldn't do. You could outlaw sin, but you couldn't stop sin. But what will happen at that time is it will be stopped, and through a series of management steps. And so and what these verses also talk about, the shattering with the rod of iron and the breaking like earthenware, those are talking about those people who, at first at least, insist on sinning, will be broken. They will be broken in in more a spiritual sense, but also potentially in a physical sense. and if they simply will not learn and adjust. I'm not going to go into that in this message. So in any case, sin will not be allowed. That's the important thing to understand, is that sin will not be allowed during that millennial period. And there will be no more war. We talked about war before in verses that talk about it. Here's Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4 saying, and he will judge, he being Jesus, of course, he will judge between the nations and will render decisions for many peoples. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. So that all sounds great. No more war, no more making weapons of war. All of what weapons of war there exist will be converted into more useful things, things that you would use to do your jobs. And so all of that craft, all of that technology, all of those things would all be turned to be productive things in society. And that's going to be kind of a summary point we're going to get to right away here. And so Isaiah chapter 2 really describes life in the millennium. It is a chapter that is focused on that whole thing and how it will be different. So that would be a good chapter for you just to go through and understand. Now, of course, a lot of it is written symbolically, so it's a little bit difficult to understand some of it. Nonetheless, that's what Isaiah 2 is about. So we have lots of quotes from Isaiah 2 coming. So we've seen already that there will be no sin and no war. What are the consequences of that? What would the world look like with that when you make those two assumptions that you won't have any of those things? So the first thing you can obviously realize is no war means that you would eliminate the entire military force of all countries and all of their defense complex, all of the companies that build the military weapons and all of those sorts of things, all of the people who do analysis of other countries' actions and spy satellites, all those sorts of things will be absolutely unnecessary anymore, and all of it will stop. So with war gone completely, we can see that right away that that's a big difference. And for the U.S., that would free up 10% of the budget of the spending budget for the U.S. government. And so right away we can see what a big difference that would make. And also with no sin, very similarly, if there's no sin, then there's not going to be any stealing, any theft, any um, murders, hurting people. None of those things will happen anymore. And so there's simply no need anymore for the existing legal system, police system, corrections system. None of those things are necessary. And so all of those people will be freed to do better things with their lives. And all of that spending will disappear too. All of that drag on our economy that the whole crime and criminal processing business is. And so all of these people, the people who were in the military and the people who were all part of the legal system, would all be freed to have productive lives. So that's maybe the biggest change is that all of this waste spending is wasting lives, and all of these lives can now be productive lives, doing things that actually make society better. And how many times have we looked at criminals? Maybe we've seen stories about clever criminals who thought up all sorts of wonderful ideas for ripping off people or doing whatever they did. And we say to ourselves, if only they would put their talents to good purpose, they could do well in society, but they just don't. Instead, they do evil things to people. And so that's exactly what we're going to see here is all of these people put together and freed to do productive things. Now, of course, we might wonder exactly what would happen with unemployment and things like that. But with God in control, we know that the whole thing is going to work. And maybe some of these things would phase out. Who knows exactly how? The Bible doesn't talk about that transition. But nonetheless, the end result of that is going to be all of these people and all of that spending will be freed to be productive in society. And so right away you can see the big consequence of that is financial. A huge increase in the ability to free up money to do better things with it. Big changes in what would be available to help people who are suffering. So the big financial change there, but also a big happiness change. No more fear of crime. That's a big weight on society right now is that a lot of people live in fear of the crime in their neighborhoods, for example, or of things just generally happening to them when they're out traveling or who knows what they might be doing. So happiness increases. People are free to live what kind of lives that they want to, godly lives, of course. and without any fear that they're in danger or anything bad could happen to them. All of those sorts of things will come to an end. So what we've talked about before, and we'll dig into some more now, is this whole idea of the rod of iron. What is meant by the rod of iron? And the Bible is actually pretty clear about that. It is clear that Jesus will rule the world through transformed people and angels. Now remember, transformed people is that word that I'm using to describe those people who were resurrected to new bodies and transformed into new bodies. And so these two groups, the transformed and the angels, would serve society in a different way. And part of it would be replacing that whole legal system. And so they would serve ordinary people as teachers, teaching about God and his ways. And we're going to see a great verse about that coming up right away. And others of those transformed people and angels would act as guides. That's the word I've chosen for them, for lack of a better word. They would give individualized warnings about situations that are coming and how to avoid those and deal with them. And so an example might be that there was somebody who was thinking of doing something bad. They would come to that person perhaps the day before he did that and begin talking to him and explaining to him, there's a situation coming up in your life. You can't do that. That won't be accepted. You'll be punished for that if you go ahead and try to do that. So don't do that. Instead, what you should do is this, and things will be better that way. And that would also relieve us of a lot of other problems that we have that are instantaneous things. You go out on the street, you're walking along, somebody says something nasty to you, and all of a sudden you want to retaliate. And so these guides would be there to warn you about these situations and to tell you how to deal with them. What's the best way to go ahead and go through with your life and not encounter this situation and get into a problem with it. So that would be what the guides would do. There would also be enforcers. And so if someone didn't take the warnings they were given about what was coming up and didn't deal with it in the correct way and instead decided to deal with it with violence or whatever they were going to do, the enforcers would be there to just stop it from happening. They would be there to step in and say, nope, you're not going to be allowed to do that. And the consequences that would come out of that are another topic for another day. So I want to read this verse here from Isaiah 30, verses 20 and 21, actually, which talks about the people who are actually doing this at that time, the people who are doing the guide work particularly. And the verse says, your teacher will no longer hide himself, but your eyes will behold your teacher. Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. And so that's what the people would be doing at that time, God's people, of course. So there's also going to be major changes spiritually. And Isaiah talks about that as well. It talks about people of that time joyfully going up to the temple. And here's the verses that talk about that. It says, now it will come about that in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. So note, and this is critical to understand, these people who are saying, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord in a joyful way, are the people who were unbelievers. And when Jesus returned, they were the people who rejected God and would have nothing to do with him. And so now they find themselves as people who know nothing of God or nothing of his ways. And so that's what they want to do, is go up to the temple and meet with the Lord and learn about him and learn about his ways so that they can walk in his paths, it says. And so that's wonderful. And that's an attitudinal change. That's not the kind of people that we know of right now who are the unbelievers. The unbelievers would never think of saying such a thing. So that spiritual change is a major step that's going to happen as well. So more on the spiritual side. Arrogance is a problem in our society that we don't often realize the depth of it. And Isaiah 2 talks about that quite a bit. I've got 3 different sections of verses here from Isaiah 2 that talk about arrogance being crushed during that time. And God simply won't have people who are arrogant. So, first of all, for the Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, and against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be abased, which means lowered down, get his attitude reduced so he isn't so proudful. Next verse. The pride of man will be humbled, and the loftiness of men will be abased, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. But the idols will completely vanish. And then the last verse that I have here, in that day men will cast away to the moles and the bats their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship. So what's happening here, and Isaiah goes on in much greater length about this whole reduction of arrogance, and we don't understand because we live in it so much. We kind of live in a swamp and don't recognize how much the swamp is a swamp, and because of that, we don't understand how arrogant people are in God's eyes, and so they might not be so arrogant in our eyes, but in God's eyes they are. And that applies to a lot of Christians too. But certainly anybody who rejects God is even more arrogant than that. So we're talking about this whole crushing of arrogance and reducing people's arrogance down. And part of that arrogance, as it talks about, is idols of silver and idols of gold. Now, it doesn't really mean literal silver and gold metal idols. It's talking about all of the things that we worship, and that's what that verse says. Those things they made for themselves to worship. And so all of the things that we thought were wonderful about ourselves and wonderful about our society and all of our technology and all of the great things that we thought we had done, all of that will be crushed down and destroyed. God won't have any of that.